Hello. Hi, Javier. Welcome to have you. So we are on. Javier, could you tell me, did we do the civil rights movement last week? Because I know with one or two classes, I did both World War II and the civil rights movement, but I may have just done World War II. Oh, we did not do. Okay, okay, that'll work. All right. So we're gonna go over the civil rights movement, okay? So let's see here. All right. So on the intro, right, I give the what they call Javier the structural history of the civil rights movement. And remember, structural history is when it's opposed to great man history. When you look at men and women who made things happen, um, you look at structures, you look at forces that are bigger than any individual, and what those forces did to help bring an event about and push history in the direction in which it went. So with this one, right, you have a World War II. You have that World War II with the Atlantic Charter. It enhanced a sense of a positive sense because you don't always hear this in a positive note, but it enhanced a positive sense of entitlement amongst minorities. Like, yes, we're fighting this war against fascism and we're fighting it for the dignity and the human rights of every individual on the face of the planet, regardless of country, regardless of ethnicity, etc. Because they were battling against the Holocaust and the German Nazi people's community and fascism, okay, and ethnic chauvinism. And so, at any rate, that enhanced their sense of entitlement and so did participating in the war effort. Black women working in the East Bay as Rosalie the Riveters, Black and Hispanic men fighting, Asian American men fighting in the war effort. That has historically done a great job in enhancing the sense of entitlement to certain basic rights when you put your life on the line for your country and serve with a uniform. All right. And then in addition to that, right, along with the enhanced opportunities of fighting came the enhanced opportunities post-war. It created the military-industrial complex. That's what Eisenhower called it, and it was just a complex relationship, or perhaps not so complex, between the federal government and corporations and the armed forces, trying to constantly uh, either demonstrate or bluff to the Soviet Union that we had a better military arsenal than they did, and they did not want to provoke us. All right. And so there's a really good book called Ike's Bluff, and it's pretty good on the president's stance in that manner and his desire to always exude strength on behalf of the nation. And it's also interesting that he didn't want the military industrial complex in many ways to develop. He saw the dangers of it, of creating you know, a bit of a plutocratic relationship between big business and government, creating a police state. But nevertheless, he felt it was absolutely necessary to keep the Soviet Union at bay. And whatever, you believe or don't believe about the military industrial complex, in the short run, it primed the pump. It got things going. Gross national product, per capita income, and disposable money, all of that went up in the 1950s overall. And so you have that going on. And then you have the GI Bill. And the GI Bill afforded a government subsidized college education to veterans. And that means Latino veterans. That means African American veterans, Asian American veterans, and as well as an FHA, Federal Housing Association loan for your mortgage for a home. And so now, right, you're creating a quote colored middle class. And there's a correlation. I'm not sure of I could make my guesses, my hypotheses about this, but that's all they would be. But there seems to be a correlation. There have been experiments, like in sociology, et cetera, and psychology, with people standing up for their rights in a given situation in which they have no idea they're being tested out in the public square. And they have found a correlation that a lot of those who stood their ground, right, and that were, let's say, for instance, they were at some type of salesman, marketing area, and they were trying to purchase something, and they were being cheated in one way or another deliberately to be tested. They found that overwhelmingly those with more money and especially more education stood their ground and demanded their rights, etc. So supposedly you can't underestimate the development of a colored middle class in the 1950s and 60s. And as you see, right, you look at a lot of the leaders of the different civil rights movements, and a lot of them were college educated. And that's probably not a coincidence. All right. So you have that going on. And then you also have the fact that we were called out by the Soviet Union on how we treated our people of color during the decolonization movement in Africa and Asia after World War II. As they were becoming decolonized, we were rushing to have them become allies in NATO. And the Soviet Union, of course, was trying to get them on their military contingency side with the Warsaw Pact. And the Soviet Union tried to preempt them from joining us by telling them, look how they treat their people of color in their own country. And they threw our racial discrimination in our face to keep us from getting allies. And so it's probably not a coincidence that right after that, Truman desegregated the armed forces. So in the Cold War, we are looking for developing countries' alliances, and we're trying to win them over. And so it's in our best interest to treat our people of color uh, publicly better. All right. So those are some of the structural things that happened, prior to the civil rights movement that helped bring it about. Okay. But at the same time, right? And you notice this was like in the Cold War one. When I do I'm off and on with doing the Cold War one. It's kind of a short excerpt. But while you have a strengthening of a colored middle class, of a heightened sense of entitlement uh, during and after World War II, you also have discrimination. You have blatant instances of hypocrisy, and the people of color are well aware of that. So not only are they being armed, are they being built up to expect more, but they're becoming disappointed with what they see. And so, of course, a perfect example of that is discrimination in the schools. On the next assignment, should you choose the one in the schools, you'll have choices on the Chicano movement. You'll see that the Latino kids they were largely um, groomed to stay in the blue collar class. They were oftentimes sent to workshop instead of the equivalent of AP and college prep classes. They were not by the advisors, nor the administrators, nor the teachers prepared for a four-year university. Instead, they were groomed to become tradesmen in one art or another, and there wasn't much of a chance given to them. They were punished for speaking Spanish, um, or they were separated and put in classes that were tantamount to being like special education classes because they had linguistic challenges. So they had a lot of impediments facing them in the public school system, and they were well aware of that, and they were not happy about that. All right. Politically, there was still gerrymandering, whereby they manipulated the districts to keep the Latino people in a numerical minority in whatever district they put them in, and that was, of course, very deliberate. They gave them poll taxes that they knew many could not afford. They gave them literacy tests that were designed to be difficult for learners of the English language and other impediments to their political ascendance and participation. And then socially, they were still considered, as you could see in the political organization video, if you choose that one. There was an episode in Crystal City, Texas, that helped spark everything, and it was over cheerleaders at a high school, and what kind of aesthetic was considered pretty and acceptable. The Latino, darker hair, darker eye, darker skinned young girl, or the blonde, blue-eyed white girl. And so socially, they had impediments that they faced where they were still kind of stigmatized and marginalized, kind of kicked to the corner culturally, socially, right? The Texas Rangers had a terrible reputation for how they treated Latinos in Texas, and as far as police treatment, it wasn't equitable. It wasn't fair and equal. All right. And then you had, other things pop up to create a sense of discourse, of people talking about civil rights. Of course, you had Brown versus the Board of Education, right, in 54 and 55 in Topeka, Kansas, the segregation of black kids. And they famously used like the black dolls or the white dolls with the young black girl. And the black girl contends that the white dolls were the pretty ones and the black ones were the ugly ones. And it helped them make their decision that segregation in schools was psychologically degrading to the black kids in a manner in which perhaps could never be undone. And so that was huge in eliciting attention on the subject of civil rights. And then once they desegregated, uh, they ordered the desegregation. They said that it must be done in all with all deliberate speed. Well, that's kind of a relative term, right? And so the University or in Arkansas, you had the Little Rock Nine black kids that went to a Central Valley high school and got lots of publicity. The state militia were used to keep them out of the classes by the racist governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, and the president had to intervene and nationalize the militia and make them go from discriminated against the black kids, the Little Rock Nine, to chaperoning and protecting them and taking them to and from their classes. So it was a great example of, in our federal republic, of the federal government flexing its muscles against a racist state, all right, in the South. And then you had The Feminine Mystique, was written by Betty Friedan, and that popularized the notion of the desperate housewife who wanted more for and with her life than merely to be a mother and a wife. And she wanted to use her college education. She wanted to gain a college education. She wanted a career of her own, etc. All right. So moving on to number one, what I do is I say that while the fights in the courts were very noble and very hard earned, they weren't enough. They just simply weren't enough. So some of these cases, right, they were evidently big, but you just haven't heard of them. So you have Smith versus Allwright. You have Morgan versus Virginia. You have Shelley versus Kramer. You had a painter, last name of Painter, that was pretty big. Of course, the biggest one, arguably, Brown versus the Board of Education. All right. And you have these cases, and that's great. They declared that, certain contracts with residences and housing could not be made any longer to discriminate against people of color and not giving them a chance to obtain a mortgage and a house loan. You had people fighting for um, desegregation in schools. You had the equivalent of the Brown versus the Board case in Texas with the Mexican Americans, where they won a big case. And, it's great, right? But the enforcement, public endorsement, public change of policy, public change of behavior, none of that is guaranteed by merely winning a case in the court. All right. I think an example of the insufficiency of winning in the court could be found in the speeches of Malcolm X. If you look at some of the speeches Malcolm X made, televised, he basically says, NAACP and these other movements, the Latinos were LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens. Uh, Show me where these gains have been obtained. Show me what I should be happy about and optimistic about with these so-called victories in the courts. So what I do is I go with that and with the poor enforcement of these decisions and so forth. And I say that hearts and minds needed to be won over. And I go so far on number one as saying that to a limited extent, that did happen. And that happened with nonviolent civil disobedience. All right. So most famously, arguably, was SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC. The equivalent for the Latinos was MAYO, the Mexican American Youth Organization. Of course, the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with Martin Luther King Jr., participated in nonviolent civil disobedience as well. And so in doing so, right, they kind of amalgamated the philosophies and the teachings of Jesus and Gandhi. All right. They say that the human heart has to be won over for meaningful change. All right. I think of there's a video that you could find. It's a little bit difficult to find, but if you YouTube Birmingham footage and of 1963, and you find a screen that's rather just like silver and gray when it's paused, and it's only about like 9 minutes long, um, and it shows footage at Birmingham of peaceful protesters being attacked by police dogs, batons, policemen, and of course the infamous fire hoses. And while that's happening, they synthesize a speech by King while you're watching this horrible footage. And he basically says, this is a loose paraphrase, but he says, you could continue to pull us out of our homes in the middle of the night and we'll still love you. You could lynch us, we'll still love you. You could deny us entrance into your schools and we'll still love you. He says, our capacity for enduring injustice will basically overcome your capacity for carrying out injustice. And in enduring such injustice, in the end, we will not only win our rights, but we will win you. We will win your hearts and minds in the process. All right. And that's what the hope was. Gandhi called it soul force of winning your oppressor over through shame, through remorse, and through compassion. So you have to take the high road. You see a civil law that's in violation of a higher natural law, and you disobey that civil law, knowing that there is going to be an ugly reaction by the powers that be, by the colonizers against you. You have to take the high road and endure their violence, endure them spitting on you, maligning you, verbally accosting you, and so forth. And eventually they have to go to sleep and they have to think about their actions and they have to realize, and it has to hit them, that you know what, maybe that law isn't right. And notice how that person never retaliated against me. He just took the high road. Maybe I'm the bad guy. That's the optimistic hope in the concept of soul force with Gandhi. But not just your oppressor, right? Is you make sure that there's a camera and it's showing everything for the country to see, because there was hope that the average American, the great masses of Americans, were, as the Romans would say, are just tending their own garden. They're living their own private lives. They're not really confronted by the realities that Black people were facing and Latinos, etc. And so it just wasn't a reality to them. Nothing that really, hit their day-to-day life. But when they sit down with their TV dinner to watch TV in the evening, this ugliness will be displayed right before their very eyes, and they can no longer ignore it. And so now, from being kind of self-centered and privately oriented, now they're ashamed. Now they are indignant. Now they want change. Now it's evident how ugly it is. Now it has hit home for them, and now they're going to demand change. That's the hope. All right. Well, with the four boys at Greensboro who went to the whites only lunch counter at Woolworth's in North Carolina, the first day they heaped abuse upon these four Black boys, these college boys. But the second day, they had a white crowd that was sympathetic to them, chanting, supporting them, etc. You look at the Freedom Summer down in Mississippi, and they did a myriad of things. They registered people to vote. They raised money to get them to pay their poll taxes. They helped prepare them for the literacy tests. They helped, encourage them as to who would help them, as for whom they should vote, and a myriad of other things to politically arm them. And in doing so, the number of white volunteers, especially from the Northeast, was rather impressive. Thousands and thousands volunteered, white Americans, many of them young. Same thing with the Freedom Rides when they rode the buses integratedly through the South with CORE, Congress on Racial Equality, Bayard Rustin and Jim Farmer leading it. You had a lot of white volunteers. You just did, many of whom suffered badly or even lost their lives protesting. You also had NBC air something called the American Revolution of '63, contending that, especially with the March on Washington, that the popularity of the nonviolent civil disobedience movement was at its height, at an all-time high. That white America was being won over, that there was a bona fide people's revolution that was transpiring at this time. Taylor Branch, his book is pretty big on this topic, and he he portrays a picture of a rather scared and hesitant federal government that doesn't want to alienate Southern Democrats who are racist and their support in Congress, with a population that was increasingly radicalized, tired of discrimination, and ready to help people of color. All right. So at any rate, I try to contend that the nonviolent civil disobedience movement was rather successful in winning hearts and minds, more so than the fights in court. However, admirable those court fights were. Okay, excuse me. Right. Then I do a 180. And then I say nonviolent civil disobedience did not work with everyone, that there had to be more militant groups to put a little bit of fear not only in the racist elements of the American population, but in particular among the governing politicians. All right. So, I mean, let's face it, you guys. You had people who saw this treatment of the nonviolent, civil disobedient protesters and laughed and cheered and wanted to participate in acting violently and oppressively toward them, who absolutely enjoyed the injustices and supported them against the people of color. So, this nonviolent civil disobedient movement, I don't pretend on number one, was successful with everyone. All right. Much less, leading Southern senators. So I contend, since there was no one size fits all method of protesting that was successful with everyone, it was actually in the long run and at the macro level, it was actually useful that there were black militant groups that might win. I have here the begrudging respect or elicit the necessary sense of urgency and even fear necessary for those unmoved by King to feel obliged to concede changes. All right. So at this level, you have, for instance, the Black Panthers, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale in Oakland. They'd oftentimes pack guns. For a while, actually, they had no bullets in the guns because that was illegal and they could get arrested for that. But at any rate, they would usually have bullets separately with them. And they would pack their guns and they would follow cop cars as the cop cars pulled over black men and women to protect those black men and women from the cops. They likened in their ideology and in their writings and speeches, they likened the police force to a foreign power that had colonized the black people and was occupying their land as colonizers, as occupiers. Right? It was that much in a light of us versus them. Uh, yeah, as if they were a foreign country conquering the black people. They did not push for integration. They had organizations as far as, childcare, education. A lot of them were connected to Merritt College, by the way. Um, uh, Childcare, education, food, clothing, and quarters. Um, all of that they wanted for the black people themselves in the East Bay of Northern California. They were so averse to, well, in this case, not so much assimilation because they certainly were not for assimilation, but they were so averse to cooperation with the federal government and compromise that the counterintelligence program of the FBI uh, it kept following them and um, bugging their phones, etc., so that it ended up digressing into violent clashes in Oakland and elsewhere between the FBI and the newly devised SWAT team. The initial SWAT team was very reactionary. A lot of veterans who were anti-civil rights movement, white armed forces veterans who were rather uber conservative, who fought in the initial SWAT team in Watts, where they had the big riots, where that boy was pulled over by a cop, and his mother came to the car and had a confrontation with a cop, and it turned into a citywide riot, and in Oakland. So at any rate, you also had Malcolm X. Now, technically, he was just in charge of the mosque number 7 in Harlem, New York. But he increasingly spoke on behalf of the Nation of Islam, oftentimes initially without the express permission of Elijah Muhammad, the leader's movement. And eventually he's going to be censored, punished by his own organization. And then, of course, when he made a change into becoming more of a universalist in his religious beliefs, with non-African American, non-black Muslims, some tie his death to the Nation of Islam itself. But at any rate, with Malcolm X, he was very, I mean, I would challenge you to, not challenge, but I would ask you, invite you to watch some interviews and speeches by Malcolm X. He was always just very articulately right to the core of a matter, very matter of fact and brutally honest. And he was not for assimilation. He was not for integration and coexistence. He wanted black people to separate and go back to Africa. And he wanted NATO to help pay for it, or the UN. So at any rate, these movements, they scared. If you look at the Stokely Carmichael episode in LA, or I'm sorry, the Stokes episode in LA, and other episodes of violence between cops and members of the Nation of Islam, there was great fear amongst the white, kind of racist, reactionary establishment. And in fact, right, what I conclude with is from a book, uh, it contends that Governor Otto Kerner left a report on urban violence. Look at here. It suggested that systematic racism was to blame for the riots in most places. Not personal, but convenient and traditional to hire white men. And that affirmative action was needed to placate minorities. Federal mandates to hire a certain percentage of them, regardless of merit. President Lyndon B. Johnson began his embrace of Kerner's report. And what philosophical approach, logic, pathos, etc., did the president utilize to convince Congress that affirmative action was necessary? By a speech on the Watts riots and how they likely could be a precursor to more racial violence if nothing were done to help the young black men. So note, right, a part of President Lyndon B. Johnson, right, became president when Kennedy was killed in November of 63. Lyndon B. Johnson largely convinced Congress, or the Senate in particular, to support affirmative action policies as a part of his Great Society, as he called it, and his war on poverty, largely by way of scaring them and telling them that if nothing was done to help the young black men, these riots were only going to just increase in number and spread throughout the country, throughout the major cities. So hence, right, I said there was a sense of utility, of usefulness of these quote black militant groups that helped give a sense of fear and urgency to the racist white establishment that was unmoved by the nonviolent civil disobedient movement to act in some way to try to mitigate problems and placate them, try to make them less angry. All right. And then, of course, you had the Brown Berets in LA. You can see that in one of the videos that you have to choose from with the Chicano movement. You see that with La Raza Unida, the People's United Party of Mexican Americans, and how they kind of tinkered between what they wanted as far as staying within the Federal Republic of the United States, but being almost sovereignly independent as their own area of Aztlan, of the famous homeland of the Aztec. It's a very interesting combination. That's the 10-point program of the Black Panthers. If you wanted to take a look at that. And then number three, since I already gave you structural history, I give you great man and great woman history. And this one's pretty upfront. It shows how key individuals triggered events and helped them transpire in the manner in which they did because of their decisions, because of their behavior, because of their personalities, because of their influence and charisma, their organization skills, etc. These were special people. So Irene Morgan and Rosa Parks standing up for the rights of African Americans in public busing. Then you have Reverend Dixon and Reverend King Jr. and putting together the organization to boycott the buses and have their speeches and meetings in the churches that worked pretty darn well and got a lot of publicity. Then you have, like I said, CORE and SNCC, Mayo for the Mexican Americans that went door to door, registered people to vote. As you'll see in the political video for Mayo and in Crystal City, Texas, the Cristal movement, people like Jose Angel Gutierrez were go-getters. This intellectual who wore these spectacles, he was a warrior. You look at just the way he spoke, he was angry. He was often angry in his tone and with his articulation. And it shows in the video. All right. And that's on the political one, if you choose that one, on the next assignment with the Chicano movement. But they, they raised money. They raised money to pay for the poll taxes. They educated people to pass the literacy tests. They organized them together to vote collectively for a Latino or Chicano candidate on election day. And they used their numbers in great strength. All right. At the schools, you had the famous December 9th walkout. And yes, Saul Castro was instrumental as a teacher in helping to organize it. But if you watch that video at the fight in the schools, you'll notice that there were a lot of students, of Chicano students, who were highly instrumental in leading this entire movement. It was not as if just the teachers and administrators were, or mainly teachers, were leading this and the kids were following. The kids were right at the forefront of everything, as you'll see in the video, if you choose that one. All right. Pardon me. Then, of course, you have Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, right? And with them, you have, so that's Jose Angel Gutierrez in the brown shirt and glasses. Of course, that's Cesar Chavez next to him. Those are the leaders of CORE on the top left. That's King, that's a Greensboro 4. Mrs. Nash and Carmichael and Bob Moses are there in the left middle with SNCC. That is Corky Gonzalez in the right middle, who was elected to lead the movement in Denver, Colorado for La Raza Unida Party, the Mexican American Party. He also was famous for his I Am Joaquin, Soy Joaquin poem. And I would invite you to read that poem, to Google it. It's very interesting. It very much identifies with the indigenous part of Latino ancestry, much more than the Spanish part, as far as their pride and identity. And then you have the heroes in Arkansas at Little Rock, the Little Rock Nine, and just look at the hatred that this young lady is incurring, the wrath of the women behind her. And of course, you had the federal troops there supposed to be protecting her. So at any rate, back to Cesar Chavez, right? With Cesar Chavez, right? They did the things that we've mentioned already. going door to door, registering people to vote, etc. Of course, they got people to unionize the farm workers into the United Farm Workers Union. Of course, they went on strike, huelga, right, as they called it, right? And but a few things they went were like extra mile, you know. So for one, uh, the scab workers. Oftentimes, employers could just employ scab workers to take the place of the strikers, and everything goes on as before. And the strikers, it's proven to be time to time that the strikers are unfortunately uh, expendable. But in their case, right, they would just be so instrumental in what they said to the scab workers in getting them to quit as well and walk off the fields at the ripe time, right when the grapes and the other fruits needed to be picked before they rotted. They would get them to leave and join them in their strike. And that was just unique. It just really was. As far as the use of publicity, some of the growers would drive men in trucks and spray pesticides on the protesters, and they were able to get cameras there to show proof of it. Okay, and that made, of course, the growers look terrible in the public eye. You had his famous, pilgrimage to Sacramento, his famous fast, and other things that brought great attention to his movement. And of course, the popularity sprang as well when John F. Kennedy, his brother Robert, Bobby, came and publicly supported him, as did Martin Sheen and other leaders of Hollywood. And so that all helped greatly. But then what he does, that was kind of seems to be typical of Cesar Chavez, is being so sharp, but also just being a decent human being. Is He sent workers to work as scabs undercover to prove that the table growers were lying about what they provided for their workers. They were lying to the public and saying they were paying their workers more than they really were, providing them more descanso or rest, and sombra, shade, etc., right? And so they put together evidence of the table growers, the grape growers lying. They come back to Cesar Chavez, and Cesar Chavez easily could have just gone to the press and made liars of them, and that would have greatly enhanced his leverage. But instead, right, he has to personally speak with the employers, and he tells them, I have this on you. I have evidence that you're lying to the public. You're lying to the people about what you're offering your workers. He says, I'm willing to keep it secret and not humiliate you publicly if you just come to terms with me. Come to terms, recognize my union, let us engage in collective bargaining over our wages, over our rest, our access to shade and water, etc. And they gave in and said yes, they took his deal. And so that's the way he was. He was very, very resolute to the point of being obstinate or stubborn, but just a very decent human being. Um, and Dolores Huerta as well. So at any rate, these key individuals, right? People would say things would not have been the same had it not been for their involvement in the civil rights movement. All right. So at any rate, does anybody have any questions? All right, you guys sure? You guys feel okay on this? All right, thank you, Javier. Thank you, Xavier. All right, so I hope you guys feel okay on this. That's really it. And so we just have two more assignments and test four, and we're done. So you guys have a wonderful Thanksgiving. I hope you're able to spend time with loved ones and rest a little. And I plan and hope to see you uh, next Tuesday. Okay? All right, you guys take care, okay? You as well. Thank you, Javier. I appreciate that. Bye bye.